Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Both Sides Now. We're really excited today to be joined by fellow Kiwi and former White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Chris Liddell. Prior to becoming Deputy Chief of Staff to President Trump, Chris attended Auckland University, Oxford University, and has held very senior roles in Microsoft and General Motors, amongst many other companies. So good morning, Chris, and thank you very much for being here.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to do this. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure, Chris. So you're in New York at the moment. What are you working on at the moment, and where do you find yourself most of the time?
So I'm doing four things at the moment, and so it's been a busy life. I'm a little overcommitted at the moment, to be honest. But my principal activity is I'm doing a doctorate. So I've gone back to school, and so I'm doing a doctorate in politics and history, which we can talk about if you're interested. And then I just wrote a book, which I'm promoting. So I'm on a bit of a book tour. And then I do some work for KKR, which is a private equity firm over here in the private sector. And then I'm on a couple of philanthropic boards. So I do some work back in New Zealand in the environmental and educational space through a foundation called Next, which we can also talk about if you're interested. And then I'm also chairman of a environmental foundation here in the US, which does accounting for climate, for carbon on a product basis, which is also an interesting topic. So sort of four different strands to my life, but enjoying things.
So give us the 30-second synopsis of your thesis, and what university are you studying at?
Yeah, I'm doing University College London. The benefit of that is I can do it both in England and remotely here in the US. So I'm looking at the relationship between the president and the president-elect over the interregnum, which is the time between when he or she is elected and inauguration, where you have this duality of power. So you have one president who's constitutionally in charge and another who's increasingly practically in charge. And how do they measure that duality when there's a crisis? So I've gone back and looked in history of some of the major crises like Hoover to Roosevelt and Bush to Obama, and sort of looked at how the president and president-elect manage the power shift when there's a crisis that spans administrations. That's the 30-second version.
Mm-hmm. And you're writing on the 5-year term, which I believe is the book that you're promoting. That's the book you're promoting at the moment, correct?
Yeah, so it's not a 5-year term, it's more a 5-year concept. So the idea is that there is so much that a president has to do coming into the system. So in a presidential system, unlike a parliamentary system, it's a bit different. And so if I tell you a story, just to give you an idea, but I'll move quickly through it. People often ask me what the most memorable day of my White House was. And I say, I had 4 years of memorable days, but the most memorable one was the last one. And that's because I was basically the last person to leave the White House at 11:59 on January 20th, 2021. And every other day, it was a beehive. So I don't know if you had the benefit of going to the West Wing, but if you do, it sort of looks a little like the TV show. It's this beehive activity with people racing around. But on January 20th, it's a shell because everyone's left. And so there's just a core staff who's managing the transition to the new administration. And my office was on the second floor of the West Wing. And so I was literally the only one on the second floor. The National Economic Council, the General Counsel had all left, Domestic Policy Council. I went down to the main floor where the Oval Office is. The Chief of Staff had gone, the Vice President had gone, and even the President had gone because he left at about 8:30. And they were rolling up the rugs in the Oval Office and taking the paintings down and putting up new paintings for incoming President Biden. And so it just struck me how there's this amazing transition in the American system where you basically have 100% turnover. So at 11:59, one team's in charge, and at 12:01, there's another team in charge. So my book's about how you manage that and how you set yourself up in the year leading up to the election to have a successful first year in administration. So it's called Year Zero, which we're in at the moment for this current cycle. And if you add Year Zero to the 4 years of constitutional presidency, you get the 5-year presidency that I talk about.
So at 12:01, does the other party just literally walk in, or is it kind of like takes a couple of weeks? Like how quickly does the other guys turn up?
At 12:01, they've got to be fully functioning. So I talk about it's a time of maximum vulnerability. So if you think about it, you're in charge of the world. You're in charge of all the nuclear codes and everything. But literally, a new team takes over at 12:01. So the president appoints around 4,000 people, political appointees, and not all 4,000 of those need to turn up on day one at 12:01, but you need to have a fully functioning White House and executive office of the president. So you need to have at least 200 or 300 of that 4,000 in place to do all the national security and other things that are necessary literally on 12:01, because the old team has gone. So it's 100% turnover.
Because obviously in New Zealand, we have quite like a sort of number of bureaucrats that kind of just move from government to government and doesn't really sort of affect. Is that just not the case in America?
No, it's quite, parliamentary system's quite different. And so if you think about it, well, firstly, the civil service is a lot bigger part of it. The civil service is big in the US. So there's 2 million people in the federal government in the US, non-military. So there's a big permanent constituency, but the top 4,000 roles are appointed. You don't have that in a parliamentary system. There's a relatively small number of people who are appointed politically, and most people have been in opposition, so that when they take over, they've had some experience in government beforehand in opposition roles. So in the US, generally, the team that's coming in, the president hasn't been there before, and all of this team hasn't been there before. So some of them might have served in previous administrations. Occasionally, like some of President Biden's people would have been in President Obama's. But essentially, you don't have that continuity that you do have in a parliamentary system.
And obviously, like the changeover from Trump to Biden was particularly, well, from the outside perspective, chaotic with those January 6th riots. Like, was that an especially challenging time? Like, so from what I've read, you were quite a key role in sort of helping to calm that situation down.
I think we can safely say it was the most contentious and difficult transition in modern presidencies. So you have to go back probably to Civil War times to find a more difficult one. So yeah, it was pretty challenging.
And what was your proudest policy achievement during your time in Trump's administration, if one sticks out for you?
Yeah, so proudest achievement would have been doing the transition. So the thing that I really am proud of is that at that time, 11:59, nothing happened except for the fact that President Biden was sworn as the 46th president. So that wasn't a policy per se, but it was an achievement. On the policy side, the ones that I'm most happy with, and it sort of speaks to my general philosophy of government, but was all the deregulatory work that we did. So that's probably not something that really is a headline grabbing, but we did a significant amount of deregulatory work, which is more like 1,000 small things as opposed to one big thing. And I did a lot of work on that.
Was there one key bit of overreach of bureaucracy or silly legislation that you got rid of from your perspective?
The thing that we made the most progress on, although it was unfinished and I think still is a huge opportunity really across the board, is permit reform. So in most Western countries now, the machinery of permitting large projects is ground to a halt. And not because necessarily of higher standards, but just because of bureaucratic sort of inertia. And so major projects, and these are good projects like infrastructure, green projects, so it's not just private sector orientated ones, it's of all nature, can take 10 plus years. And we don't have time for some of the urgent things that are going on in the world to wait for 10 years. So I think we made a lot of progress in trying to streamline permitting in probably more detail than you want. But the idea is that permitting reform in the US, probably the same in New Zealand, there's a multiplicity of agencies who have to check off. And in most cases, it's run in sequence. So we tried to change that structure to be more parallel based. And so that you still have the same standards, but you're trying to do all the work in parallel rather than sequentially. So just not necessarily lower the standards of what projects have to do, but do them faster.
So you're permitting for commercial development projects. Is that what the permits are for?
Could be anything. Could be bridges, could be roads, could be solar farms, could be
projects,
whatever. Yeah, anything that requires a government permit because there's some regulatory aspect to it. not necessarily just government spending, it would be private sector spending as well. And the private sector in the US is still the biggest driver of a lot of the infrastructure and green and other projects. So streamlining that, there's essentially an infinite amount of capital available for good projects. So you've got to find a way of making them happen.
Yes, because there's obviously in America so many levels of governments with, the federal government and the states and that sort of stuff. How much influence actually does the government have over what happens? Because I feel like in New Zealand, our government's our country's not very big. We've got one level of government and we've got, one house. And so the government has a lot of power and can kind of just sort of control what goes on if they really wanted to. Do you guys have does the private sector just get on with stuff in the States? How does that sort of interaction work?
Well, it depends on which aspect you're looking at. If you think about the innovation system, really that's to a large extent private sector driven. So most of the innovations you think of, primarily in tech sector, but also things like biotech and stuff like that, that's really private sector driven. There isn't a large government involvement. The way the government gets involved is twofold. At the front end, so the government in the US spends an enormous amount on sort of core R&D. So National Institute of Health and National Science Foundation spend a lot of money on sort of core funding of ideas. So things like the internet literally comes out of government spending done in DARPA, which is in the defense side of the government. So it seeds a lot of initial funding, and National Institute of Health does a lot of work in particular things like biotech and new drugs. So at the front end, it has an impact, and spending that money wisely is important. And then at the back end, so the regulatory side, so anything that requires any sort of regulatory approval, so new drugs, the vaccine development for COVID, for example, all of that is obviously driven by government regulation. And then any mainstream or major projects which have a public aspect to them are all driven through regulatory. So think of the government as having some influence at the front end, some influence at the back end, also does some of those activities itself, but to a large extent, the US is dominated by the private sector still.
And you obviously had the ear of the president, when you were making all these decisions. How much influence do you think you realistically had? He's the most powerful person in the world. Where do you sort of sit in terms of that power?
Yeah, so in my particular role, well, firstly, it's important to recognize the president's the only person who, in the White House, other than the vice president, who is elected. Everyone else is there as an assistant and is appointed. So you are there to help the president make decisions and then implement them. You're not there to make decisions. Some people get confused about that and think they're advocates and principals as opposed to advisors. So that's the first thing to recognize. In my particular role, I had a session with the president most days on a policy decision. I was my deputy chief of staff for most of the time there with respect to policy. So my influence was really around the agenda. So making sure, firstly, deciding what decision went to the president, although he obviously was the one who was determining the overall guidance, but sort of scheduling that, deciding what options were taken to him and which people were in the room. And the dynamics are really quite important. So each president has quite a different decision-making style. So President Obama, for example, was very analytical, very rigorous in his research. So he liked to get big briefing books, to get a series of briefings on things. So he really wanted to be the smartest person in the room. President Trump, much more intuitive, liked to have a small group of people debating issues in front of him. So my role and influence, to the extent it was, is thinking about how to choreograph meetings with the president in terms of the information that was given to him and the people who were in the room, but clearly not in charge of actually making the decision, because that was, at the end of the day, the president's.
How often did it feel like you or one of the other senior advisors challenged him on an idea and he changed his position? Did it feel like you were able to have, your ideas and policy positions were pretty well respected and heard?
Depends a lot on the topic. So there's some topics that he felt very strongly about and was pretty inflexible. So he might move plus or minus 10%. He might You might influence him on methodology. So, for example, his attitude towards China and tariffs associated with China, he was pretty rigorous about that, but he was flexible around the means, not the ends. And then other issues, he was much more open because he didn't have a fixed view on it. So because he came from the private sector, not a political, he didn't have the breadth probably of really fixed views across policy issues. So you take something like student debt, which is a big deal in the US. That's not something he had given a lot of thought through. So he would have been a lot more open to that. You talk about things like China, and he's much more fixed in his views. He's been talking about it for 20 or 30 years. So it's really topic specific.
Yeah, right. And so you mentioned things look like in the West Wing, some of those TV shows that we've all seen. Did it feel like those TV shows? Chris, you don't strike me as someone who was swept up in the drama of it all, but what is the level of drama on the ground compared to some of those TV shows?
Well, I talk about it as being kinetic, and that to me, it's just high energy. So you are racing around. It's long hours. You're there from early in the morning to late at night, and you're dealing with some of the most important issues in the world. So, and you're racing from one meeting to another. So it's not dramatic in the same way as the TV shows, or perhaps the media would like to think about it. And I often described us as the submarine below the surface. While all the storms were above the surface and people going crazy and media reports and leaks and things, there's a machinery which turns over, which gets things done. And so it's high energy. I was exhausted at the end of every day, and you're racing from one meeting to another and talking about some really quite important issues. But it's not chaotic in the way that people think about it. There's really quite a sort of cadence to it.
And Trump had a very high turnover of staff and senior staff. Why do you think that was?
He's a tough guy to work for. He's and he falls in and out of love with people. So and what happens with the president is everyone who's appointed, the political appointees, are appointed by the president at his pleasure, shall we say. So when you fall out of favor with him, he can get rid of you on a day. And unlike, say, President Biden, who's had a cadre of people who's been with him most of his political career, Trump was bringing in a lot of new people. And so they didn't work out. And he tried them, they didn't work out. And then, as I say, he's a difficult guy to work for. So, but it's also, now he was at extreme, so I recognize that. But the average length of service in the West Wing is about 18 months for across all presidents in the modern age. So people burn out, or they go on to other positions, or they come in and do a tour of duty and go. So Trump was particularly high in the turnover, but high turnover is generally a characteristic of most West Wings.
How did you end up working for him? Like you're in New Zealand. How did you end up there?
Well, I worked on the Romney campaign around 12 years ago, and I was executive director of his transition planning. And then he lost, but because he lost, I had some time on my hands, so I wrote a book, a sort of preliminary version of the one that I've just written, on how you set up the transition entity, which is an interesting entity in its own right. It's like a startup. You start with literally 2 people in our case, and by election time, you have somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people ready to do all the work that you need to do in that sprint between the election and the inauguration. So it's like building a startup over 6 months. And so there's a lot of interesting aspects to how you build a policy pipeline and a pipeline for picking people, and how you get that 75 days ready to go. So I did all that for Romney. I wrote a book about it. I gave it to the Trump campaign. I said I didn't want to be involved, but if they won, I was happy to help out. When they won, they rang me, said, come in for a couple of days. I came in for 2 days and stayed for 4 years.
And what is it about, do you reckon, about yourself that you managed to sort of, stay last the whole 4 years with Trump? You said the average turnover is about 18 months for a person. Like, how did you manage to last 4 years?
Well, I'm going to go. It's a good old Kiwi story. Um, there's an expression which goes back to Reagan, which is be willing to give other people credit for getting things done. You can get a lot done in DC. And so I basically, I had also what's another expression called a passion for anonymity. I just stayed below the radar screen, stayed away from things. I was happy to get things done and let other people take the credit and be in the limelight. So in the White House, there's a sort of an Icarus effect. You get too close to the sun, the sun burns you. So I just stay away from it.
Was Trump supportive of your ideas around year zero and your transition thinking?
He's not a planner, so not particularly. Although this cycle will be super interesting, and we want to delve into American politics for a little while. So this cycle will be really interesting for two reasons. One, on the President Biden side, so second terms are really challenging. You would think second terms would be easy because you're in government and you're just moving to the next one. But the history of second terms is that they actually underperform massively for a number of reasons. One is you're exhausted from 4 years of governing. In President Biden's case, he has to govern, and the world's on fire, so he has to deal with all of those issues. He has to win an election, and he has to do a transition to a new one. And in his case, he's had actually remarkable stability in his staff. One of the flip sides of that is he'll probably have very high turnover around first to second term if he wins again. So, and often the presidents get into this consolidation mentality. They think they've got to consolidate the gains from the first term. And like any organization, as soon as you get into consolidation mentality, you're going backwards, not forwards. So he has to get into transformational mentality, which is tough when you're governing at the same time. So that's on his side. He's got a big challenge, which is a typical one for a second term. On President Trump's side, he's super unusual. There's only ever been one other time in US history where a president has had two non-contiguous terms. The last one was in the late 1800s. And so very unusual to have a second term that's not after the first term. In his case, though, he has the distinct advantage. He's been there, so he understands it. He only has to win the election, not govern. And there's a couple of entities, a couple of foundations, which have done an enormous amount of work along the lines of what I recommend in the book. So if he decides to take advantage of it, and that can always go two ways with Trump, you can either decide to take advantage of it or decide that that's not a good idea. He could have an incredibly strong start to his second term, so we'll see.
Do you think he is going to win, Trump?
Well, the polls have Trump ahead, and I would say he's the favorite at the moment. And they, generally speaking, they narrow as you get closer to the election. But the way that I would characterize it to most people is most of the things that are going to happen this year, what I describe as event risk, because there's inevitably events that happen as you come towards the election, generally I think will be negative towards President Biden. So I have Trump mentally, if I had to put money at a sort of 60-40 to 70-30 favorite.
Would you go back and work for him?
No, I've done my 4 years. 4 years just about killed me. That's enough. It's dog years. It's like 5 years each year. They say days are like weeks, and weeks are like months, and months are like years, and years are like dog years. So I survived 4 years, but it's time for someone else to go and do it.
If Biden had have won that election instead, and he asked, would you come and work for him, would you have gone?
Yeah, I would, but the chances of that are almost zero. There used to be, when 50 years ago, you used to have people who would serve multiple administrations of both sides. You'd have people like Robert Gates, who's defense secretary, I think, for both Republican and Democrat. But it's got to the stage now where basically there's a clean out. But I have a general belief that whoever wins the election should be set up for success. The American presidency is too important to not have him as successful as possible. So yes, but it's not going to happen.
Why did you choose the Republicans over the Democrats? Because I think a lot of people in New Zealand sort of think New Zealand would typically fit within the Democratic Party, you know, most of our political parties.
Well, it sort of comes back to overall political philosophy. So, how do I think of myself? I probably see myself as a small government liberal. So I could skew either way. When you think of the liberal side of it, it's hard to go past the sort of original kind of John Locke principle of social contract, protecting life, liberty, and property rights. But then how do you apply that in the modern context? And what's happened is, and this is the small government side, is we see around the world that governments are collapsing under their own weight, and they're basically failing. There's a trifecta of failure. And so they're failing to do the basics right. They're failing to do the big things at all because they don't have the bandwidth to deal with the big issues, and they're piling on debt and bankrupting their countries, so it's a pretty ugly trifecta. And so I like, firstly, the Republican focus on smaller government, because I think it's just got too big and unwieldy for all the right reasons. You can't argue about a lot of the programs, but the collective dead weight of the government has become so large in Western democracies that, you know, basically we have a crisis coming up over the horizon. And so I like the overall Republican approach of a smaller government. And I like the Trump approach of disruption, because the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. And we have, unfortunately, an instinct in Western democracies to just fine tune plus or minus 5%. And I think the crisis that we have is so much larger than that, that unless we do something fundamentally different, we're not going to be happy with the results.
So did you feel like your values and philosophy were aligned with Trump?
You broke up a little bit on there, sorry. Philosophies. In some areas, yes, not 100%. So again, I like this disruptive nature. I think I do, as just said, I think that the concept of government needs to be rethought. I liked his approach towards the economy. So I liked his economic policies to a large extent. I liked his approach to trying to rebuild the middle class. I liked his approach towards China. I liked his approach towards trying to keep America out of wars. So there's a lot that I liked, and there were some things that I didn't like, but I think you have to be realistic when you serve someone. The chances of being 100% aligned with them on everything is pretty low. So there were some things that I didn't agree with them on, but on the big things that I wanted to try and make some progress on, yes, I was.
Do you think some of the sort of, I guess, because there's been a lot of media about Trump, and I think in New Zealand, traditionally, a lot of the media we've seen of him has been pretty negative. Do you think that's do you think that sort of do you think that sort of influenced how people sort of have viewed you and the work you've done with him? Because you've just listed a whole lot of things that you agreed with him, right? Yet that's never really been talked about much in the media.
Yeah, well, I'm not gonna bag media. I mean, but I think the whole media industry clearly has talked about crises. You know, the mainstream media is in a death spiral at the moment, and I don't even bother doing mainstream media anymore. The reason why I do this with you guys is, podcasting I think is part of the future. You can have a proper conversation as we are having, and you can decide whether you like what I say or not, but at least we can have a conversation. The mainstream media is full of good people, but it has a business model which basically is in a death spiral. And so you in New Zealand, I had the misfortune of just looking most nights or whatever at New Zealand media online. You are fed a quite a jaundiced subset of information. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a subset. And through the mainstream media. And that's, New Zealand just has a leftward leaning and obviously massively anti-Trump. And so there's a narrative which the mainstream media is happy to to do. Now, again, I'm not going to defend every aspect of what Trump did, but yeah, you get the worst of the worst. And so there's just a lack of basic understanding, which unfortunately is influenced by the media. But that's, as I say, it's just a product to a large extent of the business model that forces people to look for outrage and feed the beast. And that's a shame, but it is what it is.
So to clarify that, do you think our media is the worst of the worst in terms of its level of bias?
With respect to American politics, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I can't talk about it and everything. It's pretty good at rugby and pretty good at covering, I assume, domestic politics. But 90% of the journalists in New Zealand would be left-leaning, and that's the feed that you get, which is why I think what you guys are doing is so good, because you, at least as far as I can see, 50-50.
Do you think they're left-leaning, or possibly they're just centrist in New Zealand, and centrist in New Zealand just happens to be way left of centre in the States, and that's where that bias comes through?
Possibly. But I would say, again, I'm just doing a sample of my own. I would look at the articles that would cover American politics, and if you took the worst article in the worst publication in the US, that's the one that would appear in New Zealand. So I think there's a machine which feeds the outrage and likes to think, and this is a problem for New Zealand looking at the US, is there's a sort of a, I don't know, borderline arrogance. Like, look how good we are and look how terrible America is. And that's bizarre to me, because all the issues that America faces, New Zealand faces, the difference to my mind is that America, it's out in the open. New Zealand, it's sort of hidden below the surface. And so there's this slight impression that comes through to me as someone who lives outside but still takes an interest in the place, that you almost take a joy in feeling like America has more problems than New Zealand does, whereas in fact they're pretty much exactly the same.
Mm.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you touch on, because I think following the Christchurch 2019, the Christchurch massacre, and with the massive change in gun laws, and then also following the change in abortion laws you guys have had, New Zealand's definitely taken a bit of an approach of, as you say, like, look what we can do. We can change laws really quickly, or we're not outlawing abortion or anything like that. Do you think that does sort of just fuel that sort of maybe slightly anti-American, just sort of like narrative?
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I think New Zealand's more European than American, and so. But can we do a pop quiz? So, right track, wrong track is always the most interesting poll that I look at, and I think in New Zealand, because I looked at it a month or two back, it was something like, right, I don't know, 65 to 70% of people in New Zealand thought it was on the wrong track, which is about the same as the US. It's about 70% wrong track, 20% right track. And out of interest, are you two guys right track or wrong track? Do you think the country's on the right track or the wrong track?
Probably the wrong track.
Yeah, we're both probably wrong trackers.
Okay, so what? And the interesting about that is that when you answer that question, you're thinking about it with whatever's important to you, and each person's going to be different. But when you think about the big issues that are facing the world, and again, we can argue about which ones are the biggest, but let's just go for structural inequality, climate change, sort of changing world order, role of technology in our lives. All of those things are challenging as much for New Zealand as they are from the US. In fact, things like climate change, which I know you're interested in, Finn, New Zealand's performance is worse than the US, despite the fact that it has a clean green image. And so there's something in the New Zealand psyche which is just some mixture of unhealthy mixture of complacency and arrogance, which I think is not a good idea.
Is it okay though? Like, personally, I'm quite proud of our stance on gun laws and abortion reform. And you're right, our action on climate change certainly doesn't translate to our political will that we have. But is it okay to take pride in some of those things as New Zealanders on a policy front, and it doesn't necessarily have to come with an arrogance that we're better than the States?
Yeah, oh, 100%.
Mm.
But there's a difference between pride and arrogance, right?
Yeah, totally.
And so absolutely should be proud of every aspect of it. And there's some things, just as there are in the US and every other country, that should be enormously proud of. But it's when you slip into arrogance that I think is a problem. And when you have filtered information about other countries, that's not good. So be proud, but a little humility with the pride doesn't do any harm either.
What do you think's driven that perceived arrogance that's come out of New Zealand then?
I don't know. It's quite different. And I'm going to sound like the old guy here. It wasn't my parents' generation, definitely not. It's sort of come with the confidence that's been built in New Zealand. So when New Zealand opened up in the 80s and 90s, I think it gave people a fresh sense of confidence when they took away some of the constraints that have been in the country. And maybe with that confidence slips into overconfidence. And then, the COVID thing, obviously, with the incredibly strong performance initially with COVID, that sort of fueled it a little bit. New Zealand does outperform, in particular on sporting, above our weight. And so that fuels it a little bit. And maybe there's just a little bit of I don't know what, lack of small countryness. We want to feel proud of being a small country and how good we are. So I don't know. And I don't want to overstate it. So I just want to say that in particular, in this aspect, it's just something that I've noticed.
Yeah. Well, one of the areas we are probably doing better than the States on is polarization. The US has this massive level of political polarization that we don't have in New Zealand, although that's growing, worryingly growing in New Zealand. Absolutely.
Totally. Totally disagree, but okay, go.
No. Let's land. Do you think New Zealand has the same level of polarization as the US does?
Yeah, you just don't admit it.
And interesting. I mean, even though polarization manifests itself in extreme events like the riots, and there's only obviously the political system of the states only lands yourself in two parties, right, which lends itself to a bit more polarization than New Zealand, because we do have more plurality of views in the way you're able to manifest your political opinion. So I'd be keen to hear why you think the polarization is the same levels in both countries.
Yeah, and again, I'm just using anecdotal. I'm pushing back for the sake of it. It's much more obvious in the US. It's under the surface in New Zealand. But when I visit New Zealand, talk to people, I get the same kind of things on both sides of the spectrum. Just people don't talk about it quite so much publicly. In the US, I'd say there's 20% on each side that's extreme, and there's 60% in the middle that isn't. And there's an enormous number of people who I talk to and go to panels with and have been doing my book tour with, who are the other side of the political spectrum, and I have no problem at all preaching them. So it's much more obvious here. I'll certainly say that, much more obvious. And you're probably right. I'll concede it's probably more extreme as well. But directionally, I think it's exactly the same in New Zealand, and it's shifted quite materially. And the way I describe it here is more about tribalism rather than polarization. And I think that's the more worrying aspect. There are always polarized views. There have been for hundreds of years, where people have had extreme views on every issue, one side or the other. What I think's changed quite enormously, and I think this is true of New Zealand and the US, is what I describe as tribalism, which is you associate with a tribe, and once you do that, you agree with everything that tribe agrees with. And that's what we're seeing here in particular. If you become a Republican, you have to believe everything a Republican believes in. If you're a Democrat, you have to believe everything you're a Democrat in. How can that make any sense? You can be pro-climate and anti-abortion. There's no reason why those two things can't exist in your brain at the same time. And yet we're sort of convincing ourselves that if you sign up for one set of beliefs, you have to believe in everything. So that to me is more worrying than polarization, or maybe they're just different names for the same things. But that's the more concerning trend that I see here. But I feel like, and look, I don't live there, so you can tell me I'm wrong. I feel like that same trend's happening in New Zealand.
So do you think maybe the polarization's a bit overstated in America? Because I think with the rise, with the election of Trump, you know, everyone's sort of like seems to think now that, like, you know, he's the instigator of polarization in America, and it's, you know, really divided, and that's kind of, I guess, what the information we're getting fed through our New Zealand media.
No, it's definitely an issue, and there's lots of, you can argue whether Trump's the instigator or the reflection of it, but let's say he's a bit of both. But with technology and media feeds and the echo chambers that we all live in digitally, that's certainly feeding the beast. And so polarization is, and what I describe as tribalism, has definitely become significantly worse in the last 20 years, and in particular probably in the last 10 years, to a large extent fed through digital. And I'm critical of mainstream media, but obviously it's more than just mainstream media. It's how we consume our information, and it's much, much easier now to find a tribe online that believes everything you believe and is outraged by everything that you're outraged by, and to live inside that tribe quite happily for as many hours a day as you want to.
Do you think there's any kind of, I guess, coming back from the growing polarization? Will we ever be able to get back to a point where people can, you know, have pleasant discussions with people across the other side, and, you know, we're not living in such echo chambers?
Yes, but it's going to be a tough few years ahead. I don't see anything. I'd see it probably getting worse before it gets better. There's a new generation coming through here, and hopefully there is down there as well. So what can't go on forever must stop. It can't go on forever. So there will be something that changes it. What that is, I'm not smart enough to know. But yes, eventually we will find a positive way through it.
So at the same time as this growing level of polarization is the increasing distrust in institutions that you alluded to, both the media and also government institutions. I know you were passionate about building trust in institutions and government. Did you felt like the level of trust increased over your term in government, or decreased?
No, it's gone down pretty much across the board in all institutions for the last, I don't know, certainly decade or 20 years. And so we were no different. And that's what I'm trying to do through my book, which is a small contribution, but no, it's gone down. It's gone down again under President Biden. So there's no major institution in the US now which is above 50% in terms of public trust. So we have a big challenge. And yeah, that to my mind, rebuilding trust in institutions is one of the most fundamental things I've got to try and do over the next decade. But it's been going down for a while.
So, Chris, as you mentioned, I'm extremely passionate about climate action, climate change, and also inequality. And funnily enough, the other person we've had on the podcast who shared those views that climate change and inequality are our two greatest challenges are Jim Bolger, who's also a right-wing politician. So it was interesting to hear those two as the first two you mentioned. Just firstly on inequality, did Trump share that view with you, that inequality is one of the greatest challenges we face?
Yeah. He wouldn't necessarily use those words, but his manifestation of it was the hollowing out of the middle class. And the middle class represents, well, sorry, do you want to finish your question, or shall I just?
No, please. You go.
I caught you half. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So I talk about structural inequality rather than inequality being the problem. So to my mind, there's always going to be inequality. That's just natural. We all have different skills and so forth. And so inequality isn't the problem. Structural inequality is, where you don't have the opportunity to progress. And so it's a huge issue in the US now, the so-called American dream, where you can be better than your parents were. And what we're seeing pretty much in all Western democracies is if you are in the top echelons, you stay in the top echelons. If you're in the lower echelons, you're bound to stay there. And so, how do you fix that? That's a combination of the education system, you know, all the way back to 0 to 5, and what we do with preschool retraining, hollowing out of the middle class. So there are aspects that Trump was definitely supportive of. Whether he would use the same words as me, I doubt. But it's a huge issue in the US, perhaps less so in New Zealand, because we never had that manufacturing base that the US did. But the idea, and this is actually surprisingly bipartisan, President Biden has also done in his own way the same thing, is trying to bring back that middle class. Because if you don't have a middle class, you don't have an opportunity to go from the bottom to the top. You've got to move through, and middle class jobs were a stepping stone in previous generations. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think both presidents are actually coming at the same problem in different ways. And things like education system, obviously, which is a whole topic in its own right, which happily go into if you're interested, but also shared some of the things like vocational training. Trump was a very big positive on vocational training, and we have lost the plot in the Western world and trying to, in this belief that everyone needs to have a university degree to be successful in life. And so we're overtraining people at university level and undertraining them at a vocational level. And again, both Trump and Biden probably surprisingly share that same view. So there's aspects of overlap.
There's two different ways to approach inequality, though, right? So first is making more money to bring everyone at the bottom up to the middle class, so everyone's got a bit more. And the second is realizing, hey, we've got limited resources at the moment. We've only got so much money. Let's balance things out by sharing the wealth around from the top. Which camp do you fall more into?
Well, it's a bit of both. So you've got to have a progressive tax system, and you've got to your tax system can do one of two things. It can change behavior, or it can redistribute wealth, and it should do both. And so the tax system should be a way of at least giving people at lower income levels a better standard of life. So I think that's pretty well shared. You can argue that we have lost the plot because governments have become so big that the tax burden, they're trying to do too much with the tax burden. But let's put that aside. Let's just assume that any Western democracy at the moment spends somewhere between 20 and 40% of GDP through government services. So there's that side of it. But then the more powerful aspect is opportunity-based. And most people, I think, would be happy with a tax system if they felt like they really had the opportunity to progress upwards, as opposed to the safety net of staying where they are.
And so you've proudly worked with two fantastic environmental entities in New Zealand, Pure Advantage and the Next Foundation as well, which we'll give a bit of background on before the podcast. How do you reconcile your work there with Trump's, quite frankly, climate denialism?
Yeah, so firstly, I think you've got to do certain things top down and certain things bottom up. And in New Zealand, I've decided to do things bottom up. In the Trump side, I argued to stay in the Paris Accord, lost that agreement, so that's fine. But I think that if you look at what we're trying to do in New Zealand, why don't I talk about New Zealand first, then I'll come back to the US. So in New Zealand, and this is where I definitely push back on you, New Zealand's performance is very poor relative to the US. The US has made much more progress than New Zealand, not necessarily under Trump, but generally. And New Zealand, if you take Climate Action Tracker, which I assume you're familiar with that.
Totally, we're the worst.
Yeah, we're the worst. So let's not beat our before we say, before we throw the people in glass houses throw too many stones. Let's look at it. So in New Zealand, I mean, I think it's just bizarre that we are going to meet our 2030 commitments by buying credits on the international market. And we're going to spend between, we have to buy 100 million tons of them. We're going to spend at $50 to $200 a ton, somewhere between $5 and $20 billion by 2030 to meet our NDCs. How can that make sense? And then as a country, we're not even going to put that on a balance sheet because we don't want to recognize that liability.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'd say is we have to be honest in New Zealand about our poor performance, and then we have to do something about it. Now, I don't have any political influence in New Zealand and don't intend to. I've stayed out of it. But what I can do is bottom up things. So the work that we've done in Next Foundation, which is mainly around large-scale ecological restoration, but one of the side benefits of that is not, the main principle was biodiversity, but the side benefit is carbon sequestration, and we're orientating Next more towards that carbon side. And so we've got like some super interesting projects, which I'll send you a link to if you're interested after the podcast, is looking at Fiordland and Southwestland, which are enormous carbon sinks. And if we can change the trajectory of the growth rates inside those, we can solve through nature-based solutions. You make an enormous contribution to New Zealand's NDCs through nature-based solutions. And then the work that Pure Advantage is doing, I'm not associated with them anymore, but I helped set them up a long time ago. But their recloaking Papa Tuanuku work is super interesting as well. So that's the stuff that as a country we should be getting totally behind. It won't solve all the problems, but rather than spend money, on some bogus international credits, we should be investing it in New Zealand. On the Trump side, I think that it's a different argument up here. So there's the climate deniers, and then there's the sort of climate pragmatists, and I'm trying to influence the pragmatists. There are deniers, but the argument up here is much more around the speed at which the transition happens relative to economics. And the good news is the private sector is really driving a lot of the innovation. The way that I think we can make some progress is firstly on how we spend money on the innovation cycle that I talked about, things like National Science Foundation. I'm pro a carbon tax. There's zero chance that'll happen in the US. But there's things like carbon border adjustment tax, which could do. And that's super interesting. And that's super interesting. And that actually that's a possibility under a Trump administration. It's not totally outside the realm of possibility. So there's some things that the politics here are just different, Finn, and I'm not going to argue the right or wrong of it because I sit on the, it's my point. I don't sit with my tribe on this particular one, but I think we can make some progress on both sides.
Yeah. And how many of the 1 trillion trees did you get planted?
Oh God, we kicked that off in actually, it's humorous but not funny. That we kicked that off in Davos in January of 2020, and the first meeting that I had when I got back from there was about this strange virus which seemed to be spreading, that we gave the name of COVID. And so whatever progress we were about to make disappeared with all the focus on COVID. So I don't know how many it was in the year that I was there. I don't think the Biden administration's taken it forward to any great thing. So it'll be a rounding error.
It's interesting. You mentioned that you don't really have any sort of influence in New Zealand politics. Do you have any desire to sort of get involved or ever run for office here?
No, thank you. I'll leave it to you too. No, it's a different system, and I'm happy to help. As I say, you can influence things in New Zealand, and that's one of the good things about New Zealand is you can influence things bottom up, and it's a small economy in a small place, and you can be helpful with. In my case, it's mainly been through the generosity of someone else, not my money. A really generous family called the Plowmans who have spent $100 million over the last 10 years. and $100 million in New Zealand is a lot of money. And so I can hopefully do more positive things through that than I could ever do through the political scene. I'd need to be there full time to really contribute that way.
Do you have you at times felt a little bit mistreated by New Zealand? Obviously, at least from what I've read, we didn't even make a decision on supporting your nomination for the OECD.
Yeah, I think it was a missed opportunity for New Zealand, but what else have I got to say? These big international roles don't come around, and you have to be the right person at the right place at the right time. So it was kind of crazy for New Zealand not to support me, but I know it got caught up in the whole Trump thing, and I might have been the right person, but it certainly wasn't the right time. So it's a shame for New Zealand, because that opportunity might not come around again. And the OECD, the thing about these international organizations is quite interesting. The US doesn't get much from them. It's the small countries that get something from them. So, Helen Clark had an opportunity a while ago she tried to get in the UN. She would have been great running that. They come up once every 10 years. We should grab them when they do. But I understand, the chances of me getting New Zealand support were pretty low.
Cool. Right, well, we might wrap it up there. Finn, do you have any more questions before we head into the speed round?
Yeah, I mean, I think just my last sort of hot take to wrap things up, Chris, was I haven't quite worked out, because I disagree with pretty much everything the former president said, but you're sort of in there as the somewhat disguised greenie, wrapping up ideas and neoliberalist policy and getting across some strong evidence-based ideas. I haven't quite worked out if you're the good guy in the bad team that I'd rather be in there as a sort of rational pragmatist, for want of a better word, or if I'd rather you switch teams. Do you see yourself in that sort of way as well, or am I sort of jumping to conclusions there?
Well, I'll let you decide about. You can make the judgments based on what I say. I just think, and I'll say, when you have an opportunity to make a difference,
totally,
sometimes you just got to jump at it, and it may not. You don't always get dealt the royal flush, so. And hopefully both of you are obviously interested in making a difference to the world. If you get the chance, throw yourself in it and accept the fact that it doesn't always come with everything that you want.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I think both Eve and I talked about this. If we were in your shoes, not that would ever be a possibility, but would we have accepted the offer as well? Despite not being neither of us feeling very values aligned with former President Trump, would we have accepted that opportunity and tried to be an honest broker of information like you were, as opposed to getting in there and lobbying for our own ideas? And I think for that reason, we both have a lot of respect for your work.
Well, thanks for that. And I'd sort of finish on a high note. There's no reason why you couldn't be in the situation, not obviously the exact situation I was in, but I wasn't any more advantaged than you two were when I was your age, and I assume your audience skews young. I didn't have some grand plan when I was my age to end up in the White House. It was just a series of serendipitous moves. But if you aspire to make a difference in the world and you really are willing to take risks and stay on top of it, one of you or one of your audience may be future President X or Prime Minister Y or whatever. It's 100% possible. So
any advice for young Kiwis, I guess, who are trying to, who want to make a difference on the world stage? Because I guess, we are a small country, and sometimes it is, hard for people to see that we can actually influence. Do you have any advice to someone who you've made it on the world stage?
Yeah, well, I stick to the same core principles. So be aspirational. I always wanted to be the best in the world at something, and so stick a big stake out there. Be willing to take risks from a career point of view, and don't be complacency. One of the biggest dangers, one of New Zealand's greatest strengths is its greatest weaknesses, which is it's a nice place to live and you can get complacent. So don't, I still want to change the world, and I'm a lot older than you. You guys should be the ones like being the revolutionary charge. Don't accept this kind of like, oh, New Zealand's good, we're all happy here, look how wonderful the political system is, we all get on well with each other. Hell, you're fighting for the soul of the country. Like get out there and be a little bit more strident, not a little less complacent. So just be a bit more kind of aggressive. And then the other thing, which I think is like super important for any career, not just political, but just stay curious. I'm doing a degree. I'm still learning something every day. I'm hopefully not a complete package yet. So what I was at your now compared to what I was at your age is totally different. So just stay on the journey of learning new things and be aspirational.
Are you currently a registered voter in New Zealand or the States, or both?
I'm registered in both, but I haven't voted in New Zealand because when I went into the White House, I agreed not to vote.
Right. In your last New Zealand election, if you're comfortable sharing, who did you vote for?
That's personal, so I won't say.
No worries. Who was New Zealand's best ever Prime Minister?
Well, if I stick in my lifetime, David Long.
Mm-hmm. And interesting. And your favorite US president of recent times as well?
Reagan.
Mm-hmm. A capital gains tax? You're in favor of capital gains tax generally?
Yeah.
Should New Zealand become a republic?
Yes, but I wouldn't put it high on the priority list. And I think we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but part of the issue is focusing your energy on the things that really count. And that's yes, but not important.
Mm-hmm. Should the world have nuclear weapons?
No, but good luck getting rid of them. So the reality is they're here for my lifetime anyway.
Supportive of a sugar tax?
Yes.
Supportive of a tax on plastic pollution?
Yes.
Background checks for gun owners in the US?
Yes.
Is the Supreme Court in the US too political?
Always has been political. Is it too political? No.
Who is someone from the opposite side of the political spectrum that you admire? Can be in New Zealand or America.
Well, I dealt with a lot of people in America on the other side. Who can I? Oh, there's a guy, Ro Khanna, who I really like. He's a Democrat, a member of the House. I think he's a future presidential candidate on the Democrat side of Indian heritage, I believe. I got along with him well. We did a lot of work together on retraining and some of the things that I talked about and some of the issues I talked about. So that's in the US, but there's a lot there. In New Zealand, Helen Clark. Helen was a really good prime minister. She was prime minister when I was CEO of Carter Holt Harvey, and I always felt her a really good prime minister to work with. And then I think that her post prime ministerial career was really strong as well.
What person, living or dead, would you most like to have dinner with?
My mother.
Oh.
To say all the things that I should have said when she was alive.
Oh, are your friends equally from the left and right?
In New Zealand, yes. In the US, it's probably 2/3 right, 1/3 left.
Should the role of the UN increase or stay the same?
The UN?
Yeah.
Change materially.
Will the US stay a part of NATO?
Yes.
What will be the most important swing state in the election this year in America?
Ooh, there's about half a dozen. Pennsylvania is always a good one to keep an eye on if you want to look at one.
Should New Zealand have a restriction on how many terms a prime minister can serve, like in America with their presidents?
Don't think it's necessary. The chances of someone serving more than 3, which is 9 years, which is only just more than 2 terms in the US, is so small that it's very unlikely to happen. You throw MMP together with 3-year terms and not necessary.
And finally, the greatest All Black of all time.
Oh gosh, I'll go for Richie McCaw.
Awesome.
Nice one. Chris, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.